This is the story of a series of bugs which were installed on GB3NL in North London against a G4 station who will remain unnamed, and all this started in the beginning of 1988.
He's a silly man, isn't he? Always was a jammer and always will be. Just a wind-up merchant, just same as he was on CB. He was just a crack winder on there, really.
The first so-called revenge weapon was a CW bug which was designed to send a piece of factual information about the G4 in question in Morse code. It was installed on the roof of a wood green tower block and was mains powered and built into a biscuit tin. As with most of the devices to follow in this video, its construction was shared by two individuals. One handled the transmitter and the other created the controlling logic. One disadvantage of this concept soon made itself apparent, however. Just prior to the installation, it was revealed that the unit had an occasional tendency to run continuously instead of intermittently. As there was no time to rectify this, the decision was taken to go ahead regardless. For the first 2 hours of operation, all was well, but then the unit started to transmit its message continuously and did so relentlessly until it was retrieved in the early hours of the morning. This was the first and last time that any attempt was made to rescue a bug. The following evening, after a small modification, the unit was reinstalled. Its location was discovered by two amateurs in just a few minutes. However, when they reported this information, together with the fact that it was not legally accessible, other amateurs in North London still went to retrieve it for themselves. When they finally retrieved it the following afternoon, they said they were surprised by its complexity. Many people thought that the culprits didn't like to lose the bugs they created. Now, this wasn't the case in the North London incidents, as they would have avoided that problem by using untraceable radio or mains links, but by doing this they felt they would have missed out on the satisfaction of people discussing their design and construction capabilities on the air. Another satisfaction that the bug builders experienced was what was deemed to be hilarious and inaccurate speculations from the captive audience as to the location and method of operation of the current masterpiece.
So we went over there and had a look, and then looked up the address in the call book. Well, his mate gave us all the details, a lot of them, you know. It's just a case of checking it. Queen's got some good mates, they sell him down the line, just like that.
The first talking bug came after the CW bug. The high security location originally intended for this unit suddenly became unavailable, so the roof of a low-rise block of flats was used instead. This unit was based on a speech synthesizer IC, primarily intended for use in conjunction with computers. It was capable of sending 8 individual randomly selected messages at randomly selected time periods. This feature caused a lot of speculation as to how it was being triggered, including the possibility that the lifts in the building were setting it off. A few months later, a technically similar unit was installed inside the lighting system of one of the lifts in the multi-storey car park in Enfield Town. This unit was powered from the emergency lighting supply, as the main supply was set to time out after 8 minutes if the lift wasn't used. It was disguised in a casing and would only start working when the lift had been undisturbed for about 2 hours. The unit worked when installed but didn't have enough power to access the repeater. When the power was increased, the voltage output of the lift's power supply dropped too much. This unit had to be abandoned when the manager of the car park became suspicious and started asking questions. For a long time it transmitted continuously without accessing the repeater, but then started just to break through. By the time this was noticed, it was far too late to go in and disconnect it.
Oh dear, I think is the expression.
Pegleg's back on the output, isn't he? Yeah, well he can't go through the box, so he does his dastardly deeds on the output. Thinks I'm forced to listen to him then. But, blimey, I can't.
The next device was the Enfield Town Library bug. This was different from the other two in that it simply played a tune and was the easiest to install. The idea for this one came when the adjacent multi-storey car park was being cased. It was originally intended to be mains powered, but when this was found to be unfeasible, a battery powered unit was constructed. It was installed on the Thursday before Good Friday, which meant that it would be inaccessible for 4 consecutive days as the library would be closed. Whilst it was operating, a desperate attempt was made to foil it by reducing the hang time of the repeater to less than the off time of the bug. However, it was of course still audible when anyone actually used the repeater. The subsequent breakdown of the repeater itself was attributed to overheating due to this bug being planted. The group involved believed that this was the first time ever a bug was mentioned in national newspapers. There was also a similar but unrelated bug located in a secret subterranean location as well, which operated concurrently with this one.
So I think he's got something wrong with his eyes, that fella. No, definitely, you don't have to talk on the output.
Will you? I'll take him out.
The fourth device, and the most ambitious one, was the Civic Centre roof bug. This unit was conceived almost a year before it was finally deployed, and the placing of a bug on the roof of the repeater building had always been regarded as the pinnacle of achievement within the group. Its deployment was quite ingenious. It was decided that the best way to plant the device was by using a remote-controlled aircraft. Although a helicopter seemed the most logical choice, it was considered too dangerous both physically and financially. To provide in-flight streamlining, the unit was contained in a cylindrical plastic container, which was fitted with a parachute at the rear to ensure that it always pointed downwards during its descent. This meant that the protective padding could take effect when it landed. Due to the front portion of the Civic Centre building being several feet narrower than the rest, the first device missed by a few inches. As always, for security reasons, no attempt was ever made to recover it. It was thought, however, that once it had eventually been found, its intended location would have been immediately realised, and this eventually turned out to be the case. The G4 station, who was the target of the bug, refused to believe that such a feat was achievable. He managed to convince everyone that the only possible explanation was that the bug was thrown out of the building itself, in the hope that it would fall into some trees nearby. The loss of the first device turned out to be quite fortunate, as it encouraged the construction of a far more sophisticated talking unit, which was dropped in a similar manner, with complete success a fortnight later. The field directly across the road and in line with the Civic Centre formed an ideally placed airstrip. The aircraft was circled over the field until it gained sufficient altitude, and then flown east over and past the target. After approximately 100 yards, it was turned through 180 degrees and then dived to just above the roof heights and guided through the narrow corridor formed by all the antennas. An observer standing in Churchbury Lane, in line with the rear edge of the building, signalled the pilot by radio link to release the canister when the aircraft was almost over its target. Many amateurs travelled far and wide to look for this bug, although those who arrived at the Civic Centre thought that it was inside the 12-storey building on the 5th floor. The next day, observations of activity around the Civic Centre building revealed that initially only one person entered the building, but it is assumed that when it became clear that the bug wasn't on the 5th floor, he was joined by the G4, and together they finally had to acknowledge that there could only be one answer. This unit had a calculated battery life of 4 days. However, after about 4 hours of operation, it decided to transmit continuously for about 9 hours before resuming normal operation. This greatly reduced its potential endurance, and it is unlikely that it would have lasted many hours past its time of retrieval. Now, it should be noted that the traffic light bug, which was made for the repeater that was planted around this time, was not made for the same reason as the ones made to target the G4 station. However, after spending over an hour and a half in a car park, climbing all over and under a portaloo and subsequently breaking into it to no avail, the same G4 concluded that the bug was definitely somewhere else. The nearby bushes had a strange weed on them which looked similar to insulated wire, and he began plucking at it, hoping to find an aerial. After a lot more time searching, which included walking right past the bug several times and long periods of time spent standing right underneath it, the whole crew was observed wandering around on the roof of the shopping centre. Back on the ground, it finally occurred to them to look inside the traffic lights. Everyone assumed that due to the nature and openness of its location, this bug must have been planted in the dead of night. In reality, it was installed during a very busy period, but then again, who takes any notice of a traffic light engineer. See you next time.
And another time we was accused of it, this is how it begun, I think, is when we went up to North London repeater, because we was getting blamed for it. We went up that way to try and catch a couple of squeakies. We were really foul mouth. I'm going back about 4 or 5 years ago, might be a bit longer. That's Dave, yes.